The dark waters of the North Sea rushed by just 60 feet beneath the belly of the massive Avro Lancaster bomber on the night of May 16, 1943. Inside the cramped cockpit, Wing Commander Guy Gibson fought against the heavy controls to keep the four-engine aircraft steady at such a dangerously low altitude while the salt spray coated the windshield. The roar of the Merlin engines was deafening as they cut through the cool spring air, carrying a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen before. Behind Gibson, 18 other crews were flying in formation across the moonlight-illuminated waves destined for the heavily defended industrial heartland of Nazi Germany. They were flying into a storm of anti-aircraft fire and blinding searchlights with a mission that seemed scientifically impossible to many military experts. The tension in the fuselage was palpable as every crew member knew that a single mistake at this height meant instant death in the cold sea below. The stakes of this audacious operation could not have been higher for the Allied forces struggling to break the industrial capacity of the German war machine. The Ruhr Valley served as the engine room for the Third Reich, producing the steel and coal necessary to build tanks and U-boats and aircraft that terrorized Europe. At the heart of this production lay the massive hydroelectric dams that supplied power and water to the factories and canals of the region. Destroying these dams would not only cripple the production of armaments, but also deal a catastrophic psychological blow to the German people who believed their homeland was secure. However, these structures were colossal feats of engineering built with thick concrete and masonry that could withstand conventional bombing raids from high altitudes. The British military command knew that a standard attack would be futile against such massive targets, but the pressure to strike a decisive blow was mounting every day. Enter Barnes Wallis, a brilliant and eccentric engineer working for Vickers Armstrongs, who had spent years agonizing over how to destroy the enemy infrastructure. Wallis was a man of immense intellect and creativity who refused to accept the limitations of contemporary warfare technology. He theorized that a massive explosion detonated directly against the dam wall at a significant depth would use the water itself as a shockwave to shatter the masonry. The problem was delivery, because huge torpedo nets protected the dams and high-altitude bombing lacked the necessary precision to place a bomb right against the wall. His solution was as unorthodox as it was ingenious: a drum-shaped mine that could skip across the surface of the water like a stone, avoiding the torpedo nets before sinking to the base of the dam and exploding. This concept of the bouncing bomb was met with skepticism and ridicule by the bureaucracy, but Wallis remained undeterred in his pursuit of the ultimate weapon. The question that haunted the British Air Ministry was whether such a theoretical weapon could actually work under combat conditions. Could a pilot fly a heavy bomber at exactly 60 feet above the water at a precise speed of 232 miles per hour at night while under enemy fire? The margin for error was non-existent, as flying too high would cause the bomb to shatter on impact with the water, and flying too low would result in the aircraft crashing into the reservoir. Furthermore, the bomb had to be spun backwards at 500 revolutions per minute before release to ensure it skipped correctly and hugged the dam wall upon sinking. It was a logistical and physical nightmare that required a level of precision flying that had never been attempted by any air force in history. The skeptics argued that the plan was a suicide mission that would waste valuable aircraft and the lives of the most experienced crews. Despite the immense bureaucratic resistance and technical challenges, the project was eventually greenlit under the codename Operation Chastise. A new squadron was formed specifically for this task, numbered 617, and command was given to the 24-year-old Wing Commander Guy Gibson. Gibson was already a seasoned veteran with over 170 combat sorties to his name and a reputation for unparalleled bravery and leadership. He was given the pick of the best crews in Bomber Command men from Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand who were eager to take on a special assignment. However, even Gibson was not told the specific targets initially, only that they would be practicing low-level flying over water and cross-country navigation at night. The secrecy surrounding the mission was absolute, with only a handful of people knowing the true nature of the weapon and the intended destination. The training regime for the newly formed squadron was grueling and relentless, pushing the pilots and navigators to their absolute physical and mental limits. They flew their Lancasters at treetop height across the English countryside, terrifying livestock and startling villagers as they learned to maneuver the giant bombers like fighter planes. The most difficult challenge was maintaining the precise altitude of 60 feet over water, where depth perception was notoriously tricky, especially at night. To solve this problem, a simple yet brilliant solution was devised involving two spotlights mounted on the nose and tail of the aircraft. When the two beams of light converged into a single figure 8 on the surface of the water, the pilot knew he was exactly at 60 feet. This primitive altimeter allowed the pilots to focus on their speed and heading, while the navigators calculated the precise moment to release the spinning mine. While the crews honed their skills in the air, Barnes Wallis and his team were frantically testing the upkeep mine on the ground and at sea. The early tests were fraught with failure as the casings shattered upon impact or the mines veered off course unpredictably. Wallis watched with his heart in his mouth as prototype after prototype failed to perform as calculated, threatening to derail the entire operation before it began. He worked tirelessly to reinforce the steel casing and adjust the drop parameters, analyzing high-speed camera footage to understand the physics of the bounce. Slowly but surely, the problems were ironed out, and the weapon began to behave as intended, skipping gracefully over the waves. With time running out and the moon phase approaching the optimal window for the raid, the final design was approved for combat. The bouncing bomb was ready, but it remained to be seen if the men could deliver it. On the afternoon of May 16th, the crews were finally gathered in the briefing room at RAF Scampton, and the curtain was pulled back to reveal their targets. A gasp went through the room as the men saw the scale models of the Moan, the Eder, and the Sorp dams. For the first time, they understood the purpose of their relentless low-level training and the strange spinning mechanism that had been fitted to their aircraft. Gibson explained the plan in detail, outlining the 3 waves of attack and the specific route they would take to avoid known concentrations of flak. The mood was a mixture of apprehension and excitement as the reality of the suicide mission sank in. They were to fly deep into Germany at night alone, and at low level to attack some of the most heavily defended structures in the Reich. The briefing ended with a sober reminder of the importance of their success. As the sun began to set over the airfield, the ground crews made their final checks on the 19 modified Lancaster bombers. The massive upkeep mines were winched into place under the fuselage, and the spin motors were tested one last time. The roar of 76 Merlin engines shattered the evening peace as the aircraft taxied to the runway heavy with fuel and explosives. Gibson led the first wave down the runway, lifting his heavy bomber into the darkening sky and turning east towards the North Sea. The operation had begun, and there was no turning back for the 133 men who had volunteered for this perilous journey. They flew in loose formation, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection as they crossed the coast and headed out over the Black Water. The journey to the German border would be fraught with danger even before they reached the dams. The crossing of the Dutch coast was the first major hurdle, as the German air defense network was alert and ready for intruders. The Lancasters flew so low that they had to pull up to clear the dunes and see walls their slipstreams kicking up sand and spray. Enemy searchlights swept the sky looking for the telltale silhouette of a British bomber, while light flak tracers zipped through the darkness. One aircraft piloted by Flight Lieutenant Estelle was hit by heavy flak almost immediately and crashed into a field in flames, killing everyone on board. It was a sobering start to the mission, and a reminder that the low altitude offered no protection against a determined enemy. The remaining crews pressed on, flying under power lines and hopping over hedges as they navigated by moonlight and landmarks. The tension in the cockpits was excruciating as they penetrated deeper into occupied territory. Navigation at such low levels and high speeds was a nightmare for the navigators, who had to rely on map reading rather than electronic aids. A slight error in calculation could lead them miles off course or directly into the path of a heavily defended city or airfield. Several aircraft were forced to take evasive action to avoid high-tension cables that loomed out of the darkness at the last second. One bomber piloted by Pilot Officer Rice struck the sea, tearing the mine from its mount and filling the bomb bay with water, but miraculously managed to limp back to base. Another, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Munro, was hit by flak over the coast, damaging his radio and intercom, forcing him to abort the mission. The force was being whittled down before they even reached the target area, but Gibson and the main force pressed on relentlessly. They followed the canals and railway lines of the Ruhr, using them as guide ropes to the dams. Finally, the dark shape of the Möhne Dam loomed out of the mist, its massive masonry wall holding back a vast lake of dark water. The defenses around the dam sprang to life as the sound of the approaching bombers reached the German gunners. Light flak guns positioned on the towers of the dam and in the surrounding hills opened fire, sending streams of red and green tracers towards the aircraft. Gibson ordered his crew to prepare for the attack run, turning his Lancaster to align with the towers of the dam. He dropped to 60 feet, the two spotlights converging on the black water as the flak burst all around him. The rear gunner fired back at the shore defenses, while the bomb aimer lined up the simple wooden sight that would determine the release point. It was a moment of supreme concentration amidst the chaos of battle. Gibson flew straight and true through the hail of fire, his voice calm over the intercom as he guided the bomber towards the wall. At the precise moment, the bomb aimer shouted "Bomb gone," and the aircraft leaped upwards as the 4-ton weight fell away. The mine hit the water and skipped 3 times over the torpedo nets before striking the dam wall and sinking. A massive column of water erupted into the air as the mine detonated, sending a shockwave through the structure, but the dam held firm. Gibson circled back to draw the enemy fire, while the next aircraft, piloted by Flight Lieutenant Hopgood, commenced its run. Hopgood was hit by flak on the approach, his aircraft catching fire, but he pressed on to release his mine. Tragically, the bomb bounced over the dam wall and exploded on the power station below, destroying it instantly. Hopgood's burning Lancaster struggled to gain altitude before the wing collapsed, and it crashed into a field, exploding in a ball of fire. There was no time to mourn as Flight Lieutenant Martin began his run, with Gibson flying alongside to distract the gunners. Martin's mine ran true and exploded against the wall, sending another plume of water into the sky, but the dam still refused to break. The 4th aircraft, piloted by Squadron Leader Young, made a successful run, his mine detonating perfectly against the center of the dam. As the spray settled, it was clear that the dam was weakening, but it had not yet crumbled. It was now down to Flight Lieutenant Maltby to deliver the final blow. He lined up his aircraft with cool precision, ignoring the flak, and released his mine exactly on target. The explosion from Maltby's mine was followed by a silence that seemed to last for an eternity as the water churned and boiled. Then, slowly at first but with gathering speed, the center of the dam wall began to crumble and collapse. A massive breach opened up, and a torrent of water, millions of tons of it, roared through the gap and into the valley below. The code word "nigger" was transmitted back to base, signaling the successful breach of the Möhne Dam. Gibson and the remaining crews watched in awe as the wall of water swept away bridges, factories, and houses in its path. The devastation was absolute, and the power of nature unleashed by human ingenuity was terrifying to behold. But the mission was only half over, as the Eder and Sorp dams still remained as targets. Gibson rallied the remaining aircraft and led them towards the Eder Dam, which was situated in a deep valley surrounded by steep hills. The approach to the Eder was far more difficult than the Möhne, requiring a steep dive over a castle, followed by a sharp turn to line up with the dam. Fog began to drift into the valley, obscuring the target and making the 60-foot altitude even more perilous to maintain. Flight Lieutenant Shannon made several attempts to line up his aircraft, but had to abort each time as he could not get the angle right. The frustration in the cockpit was intense as fuel reserves began to run low and the fatigue of the long flight set in. Gibson circled overhead, offering encouragement and advice as Shannon tried again and again to find the perfect line. Finally, on his 6th attempt, Shannon managed to wrestle his heavy bomber into position and release his mine. It skipped perfectly and exploded against the wall, shaking the foundations of the dam, but failing to breach it. Squadron Leader Maudsley was next, but his mine struck the top of the parapet and exploded, instantly damaging his aircraft, which likely crashed soon after. The last remaining mine belonged to Pilot Officer Knight, who had to make a perfect run if the dam was to be destroyed. He approached carefully, making a dummy run to get the feel of the treacherous terrain before committing to the attack. On his second approach, he released the mine, which struck the wall and detonated with a thunderous roar. The dam held for a moment before the masonry gave way, and a second tidal wave was unleashed. The breach of the Eder Dam was spectacular, sending a massive volume of water cascading down the valley towards the city of Kassel. The code word dinghy was sent indicating success, and the surviving crews turned their battered aircraft towards home. Meanwhile, the attacks on the Sorp Dam were proving to be much more difficult due to its unique construction and the thick fog. The Sorp was an earthen dam rather than a masonry one, meaning it was less susceptible to the shockwave effect of the bouncing bomb. Flight Lieutenant McCarthy managed to drop his mine on the Sorp, but it only damaged the crest without causing a breach. Other aircraft were lost or forced to turn back before they could attack their secondary targets. The raid was taking a heavy toll on the squadron. The flight back to England was a harrowing ordeal for the exhausted crews, who had to cross the alert German defenses once again. The sun was beginning to rise, making the low-flying bombers visible to enemy fighters and ground gunners. Flying Officer Young, who had successfully attacked the Möhne, was shot down over the Dutch coast with the loss of all hands. Other aircraft returned with gaping holes in their fuselages, engines smoking, and crew members wounded or dead. Gibson flew his aircraft at maximum speed, dodging searchlights and flak batteries as he raced for the safety of the North Sea. The euphoria of the successful attacks was tempered by the realization that many of their friends would not be coming home for breakfast. As the surviving Lancasters touched down at Scampton, the ground crews rushed forward to see the damage and count the returning planes. The silence on the airfield was deafening as the realization of the losses set in among the waiting personnel. Of the 19 aircraft that had set out, only 11 returned, and 53 of the 133 airmen were dead or captured. Gibson landed his plane and walked slowly to the debriefing room, his face etched with exhaustion and sorrow. He reported the success of the mission, confirming that 2 of the major dams had been breached and the Ruhr Valley was flooding. Barnes Wallis was there to meet them, tears streaming down his face as he learned of the heavy cost of his invention. The immediate aftermath of the raid was a mixture of triumph and tragedy for the British public and the military command. The photographs brought back by the reconnaissance planes the next day showed the scale of the devastation in the Ruhr Valley. Miles of countryside where underwater factories were destroyed and the transport network was severely disrupted. The German war effort had been dealt a significant blow, and thousands of troops had to be diverted to repair the damage and help the civilians. The propaganda value was immense, proving to the world that the RAF could strike with precision anywhere in the Reich. However, the loss of so many experienced aircrews was a bitter pill to swallow for the squadron and the families of the fallen. In Germany, the raid caused shock and outrage as the Nazi leadership scrambled to downplay the damage and maintain morale. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, rushed to the scene and was horrified by the destruction of the dams and the power stations. He ordered an immediate rebuilding program, mobilizing thousands of forced laborers to repair the breaches before the winter rains. The flooding killed over 1,600 people, many of them foreign slave laborers trapped in camps in the valley below. The raid forced the Germans to move significant anti-aircraft defenses from the front lines to protect the dams, weakening their defenses elsewhere. It was a strategic victory that came at a terrible human cost on both sides of the conflict. The surviving members of 617 Squadron became instant celebrities, their exploits celebrated in newspapers and newsreels across the free world. Guy Gibson was awarded the Victoria Cross, the highest military decoration, for valor for his leadership during the raid. Many other crew members received medals for their bravery and skill in carrying out the impossible mission. The Dambusters, as they came to be known, became a symbol of British defiance and ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. Yet for the men who flew the mission, the accolades did little to erase the memories of the burning planes and the empty bunks in the mess hall. They had done their duty, but they carried the weight of their lost comrades with them. Barnes Wallis was deeply affected by the loss of life and vowed never to endanger his men so recklessly again. He continued to design weapons for the RAF, including the massive Tallboy and Grand Slam earthquake bombs that would destroy V-weapon sites and battleships. However, the Dambusters raid remained his most famous and controversial legacy, a testament to his genius and his burden. The technology of the bouncing bomb was never used again in the war, as the specific conditions required for its success were rare. It remained a unique weapon for a unique moment in history, a desperate gamble that paid off. The engineering principles behind the raid are still studied today as a masterclass in problem solving. The legacy of Operation Chastise extends far beyond the physical damage inflicted on the German dams in 1943. It demonstrated the effectiveness of precision bombing and the importance of elite specialized units in modern warfare. The raid forced the German High Command to rethink their defensive strategies and divert vital resources away from the Eastern and Western fronts. It also provided a massive morale boost to the Allied nations at a time when the outcome of the war was still uncertain. The story of the Dambusters has been told in books and films, becoming a central part of the mythology of the Second World War. It stands as a reminder of what can be achieved when courage is combined with innovation. In the decades following the war, historians have debated the strategic value of the raid and whether the cost in lives was justified. Some argue that the damage to German industry was repaired relatively quickly and did not significantly shorten the war. Others point to the diversion of German resources and the psychological impact as key factors in the eventual Allied victory. Regardless of the strategic analysis, the bravery of the crews who flew into the Valley of Death is undeniable. They flew obsolete aircraft at suicidal altitudes into the teeth of the enemy defenses and delivered their weapons with pinpoint accuracy. Their sacrifice is honored at memorials in Britain and Germany, where the fallen are remembered. Today, the Möhne and Eder dams stand rebuilt and serene, their reservoirs once again full of water and surrounded by peaceful forests. There is little evidence of the carnage that took place on that moonlit night in May 1943. However, if one looks closely, there are scars on the masonry and plaques that tell the story of the raid. Visitors can walk along the top of the dams and imagine the roar of the Lancaster engines and the explosions that shattered the night. The dams remain as silent witnesses to the fury of war and the resilience of the human spirit. They are monuments not just to engineering, but to the men who died trying to destroy them. The story of the Dambusters is also a story of the enduring bond between the airmen who flew together and died together. The crews of 617 Squadron were a band of brothers united by their shared purpose and their shared danger. They came from all walks of life and from all corners of the British Empire to fight for a common cause. Their camaraderie and professionalism set a standard for air forces around the world that continues to this day. The squadron itself remains active in the Royal Air Force, carrying the Dambusters' name with pride. They are the guardians of a legacy that was forged in fire and water. As we look back on the events of Operation Chastise, we are reminded of the terrible cost of total war and the sacrifices made for freedom. The young men who climbed into their Lancasters that night knew the odds were stacked against them, yet they went anyway. They did not fly for glory or for medals, but because they believed in the necessity of their mission. Their courage was not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it in the service of others. We owe them a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid, only remembered. The Dambusters raid remains a shining example of heroism in the face of darkness. The technological innovation of the bouncing bomb also serves as a reminder of the power of lateral thinking and persistence. Barnes Wallis faced rejection and ridicule at every turn, yet he refused to give up on his idea. His determination to solve a seemingly impossible problem changed the course of the war and saved countless lives in the long run. It is a lesson for future generations of engineers and scientists to challenge the status quo and push the boundaries of what is possible. The combination of visionary thinking and practical application is the key to progress in any field. Wallis proved that even the most formidable obstacles can be overcome. The raid also highlighted the crucial role of intelligence and reconnaissance in the planning and execution of military operations. The identification of the dams as key targets and the detailed mapping of the defenses were essential to the success of the mission. The photo reconnaissance pilots who flew unarmed Spitfires over Germany to gather this information were the unsung heroes of the operation. Their bravery provided the planners with the data they needed to calculate the flight paths and the drop zones. Without their contribution, the Dambusters would have been flying blind into a trap. It was a team effort that involved thousands of people working in secrecy. The impact of the flooding on the German civilian population is a somber aspect of the story that is often overlooked in the tales of heroism. The wall of water that swept down the valleys took the lives of innocent men, women, and children, as well as prisoners of war. It is a stark reminder that in war there are no clean victories, and that civilians often pay the highest price. The tragedy of the Dambusters raid is not just the loss of the air crews, but the suffering inflicted on the people on the ground. It serves as a caution against the glorification of war and a plea for peace. The waters have long since receded, but the memories of the sorrow remain. Ultimately, the Dambusters raid was a turning point in the air war over Europe, proving that the RAF could strike deep and hard. It paved the way for future precision attacks and helped to erode the myth of Nazi invincibility. The psychological impact on the German leadership, who realized that nowhere was safe from Allied bombers, was profound. It forced them to commit more resources to defense, leaving their armies on the front lines exposed. The raid was a pivotal moment that signaled the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. It was a hammer blow that cracked the foundation of the German war machine. The courage of Guy Gibson and his men has inspired generations of aviators and continues to be a touchstone for the Royal Air Force. Their story is taught in military academies as a model of leadership discipline and tactical innovation. The Dambusters March remains one of the most recognizable pieces of military music, evoking the spirit of the raid. The image of the Lancaster bomber banking over the dark water is an icon of British history. It is a story that will be told as long as there are people to listen. The legend of the Dambusters is immortal. In the final analysis, Operation Chastise was a unique convergence of genius, courage, and luck that can never be repeated. It was a moment when the impossible became possible through the sheer force of human will. The men of 617 Squadron wrote their names in history with fire and water, leaving a legacy that endures. As the sun sets on the reservoirs of the Ruhr Valley, today the water is calm and the air is still. But in the whispers of the wind, one can almost hear the roar of the Merlins and the splash of the bouncing bomb. The Dambusters have flown into history, but their spirit remains forever.